Okay, excellent. So welcome everybody to the meeting today. And it's a pleasure to have Dannica Fleuß here today. From the University of Hamburg. Maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit at the beginning of your talk so that people know your background. And it's really a pleasure to have this talk today because we all were discussing this for a long time. We were thinking that the connection between mathematical modeling and political sciences should be enhanced. And especially, I think there is now a need in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Dannica, please go ahead.
Okay, yes, hello from my side, and thank you very much for the invite and for the opportunity to talk today about my research and also to exchange with you, with this exciting group, about the following topic: the how, why, and what of measuring deliberativeness, a systemic approach to assessing nation states' quality or deliberative quality. So I'm a political scientist. I'm working in democratic theory and also with regards to empirical research on democratic quality. And this is, part of my research and also an overview of this ongoing research project that I've been working on for quite a while. I'm very excited to exchange with you afterwards also about the question what this might mean for modeling, mathematical modeling, and also with regards to current developments and crisis phenomena that we're facing in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Okay, let me briefly say something about the roadmap or plan of today's talk. So I changed the order of how, why, and what, and I'm going to speak in the beginning about the question, why should we measure nation states' deliberativeness after all, from my perspective? Then I'm gonna address the second question. So what is deliberativeness after all? And the third question will be, how should we measure deliberativeness? What are the crucial steps involved and what is my approach there? And at the end of the talk, I'm going to speak a bit about the question, to what purpose? So what may be the merits of this specific approach and how may it speak also with regards to addressing contemporary crisis phenomena and finding solutions. So why should we measure deliberativeness after all? Why should we measure nation states' deliberativeness? So this research project and what I'm going to speak about today is, or the context of this is basically that there are by now quite a lot of more or less established measurements of democracy or democratic quality within political science, social science. And democracy and democratic quality, this may not be super surprising, are essentially contested concepts. And the maybe surprising thing is that so far there are exclusively measurements of democracy or democratic quality that presuppose a quite specific understanding of what democracy or democratic quality actually means. And these are liberal electoral understandings of democracy or democratic quality. Yet democracy scholars, theoretical scholars, also empirical scholars, not so much those who have been engaged with measuring democracy so far, but theoretical as well as empirical scholars highlight that deliberation, deliberative democracy, has merits for political systems. And on the one hand, deliberative democratic theorists proclaim that nation states' political systems that are organized in accordance with the standards of deliberative democracy have an intrinsic value. So deliberative democracies are, from a normative perspective, the better forms of democracy. I'm going to say a bit more about what deliberative democracy actually means in a couple of minutes. And whatever one may think about these debates, at least we can say that liberal theorists' understanding of democratic quality that is implemented in most or almost all measurements of democratic quality is highly controversial within the overall field of researchers on democracy. Secondly, and maybe that's a bit more practical and hands-on, deliberative democracy and the way deliberative Democrats conceptualized democratic quality has a functional value. So deliberation is supposed or is assumed to bridge societal and political divides. Deliberative democracies, highly deliberative democracies, are expected and actually have been proven for a number of cases to counteract populism quite effectively, and also to promote citizens' political competencies, their knowledge, their civility, their empathy, their support towards established political institutions and so on. So to sum this up, there seem to be like a lot of good things about deliberative democracy, and it remains questionable why so far there hasn't been no measurement approach, no empirical comparative assessment that actually allows us to study democracy systematically from this particular point of view. So the gap in research, briefly put, is that even sophisticated indices of democratic quality, by now there's a number of them, exclusively assess democratic quality from a liberal electoral perspective. One notable exception is the Varieties of Democracy project, which actually picks up on a similar thought and argues that there is way more than one model or understanding of democratic quality that we need to take into account also when we compare democracies worldwide. They propose 7 models and corresponding indices of democracy, and explicitly also included a deliberative democracy index. We've been arguing in a recent publication that this index of democratic quality, of deliberative democratic quality, actually is not able to really capture what deliberative theorists and empirical researchers on deliberation mean when they speak about deliberative democracy. And the crucial problem here is that the VDEM project conceptualizes nation states deliberativeness, political systems deliberativeness, analogously to, deliberation that goes on in individual fora or in parliaments or something like that, and does not take into account that deliberative democracy is something different from, well, let's say, well-formed deliberation in a parliament or something. We cannot assess this in accordance with the same standards. And these problems then perpetuate in measurement and aggregation procedures. And the crucial problem here is that the VDEM project is not able to capture the specific characteristics of political systems deliberativeness by just basically applying the conceptual criteria and also the measurement approaches from that have been tested for small-scale deliberation to the large scale, to studying nation states deliberativeness. And from that perspective, it's a notable approach, but it's actually not able to do justice to the core thought. Let's study democracy and democratic quality from the normative vantage point of deliberative democracy and deliberative democratic theory. Yet, I think the very fact that there is so far no comprehensive measurement approach also points us towards the fact that there's actually a real challenge, or maybe a number of challenges involved when we're trying to do that. And so I'm not going to read out all these quotes, but what we can see when we have a look at these quotes is that deliberative theorists' understanding and also the wording in which they put it of what good democracy actually is or is supposed to be is often quite metaphorical, and it's at least at the first moment quite hard to see how exactly we are supposed to transform this abstract, highly abstract understanding of democratic quality into a measurement approach. So in Habermas's quite famous terms, a good democracy involves popular sovereignty set communicatively aflow. And Dreisig, for example, so one of my favorite democratic theorists, argues that democratic legitimacy is generated in the extent to which collective decisions are consistent with the constellation of discourses within the public sphere. And also from this quote, it's quite hard to see in the first moment how exactly we're supposed to transform this into a measurement approach that does justice to the standards of comparative political science and social science. So the core challenges here, when we're trying to assess nation states' deliberativeness, are theoretical, methodological, and practical or pragmatic. So at a theoretical level, there's no consensus on the conceptualization, on the precise conceptualization of deliberative democracy and deliberation. Theorists frequently use metaphorical ways to describe their democratic ideal. At a methodological level, macro-deliberativeness, so basically that's my term for the deliberative quality of nation states, of political systems, to distinguish it from the deliberative quality of individual communicative practices. So deliberativeness is often described as an emergent phenomenon that cannot be reduced just to the accumulated quality of individual communicative procedures. So it's quite hard to see how precisely we're supposed to transform this into a measurement approach again. And what's, however, not sufficient is just using existing measurement approaches for deliberative quality, such as the discourse quality index, for example. At a practical level, so deliberative democracy is a talk-based approach. It's all about how people talk to each other in politics and with what kind of reasons they justify their decisions. So at a practical level, this studying democratic quality from this perspective will require us to analyze, to collect, in the first instance, large amounts of textual data on political communication. We will have to deal and analyze textual data from diverse sites throughout political systems. And we will have to deal with large amounts of textual data. And all this confronts us with challenges at different levels. So what I'm proposing to address these challenges. So the basic approach here is to join two research traditions. On the one hand, deliberative theory and the conceptualizations, also some of the methodological tools that have been tested and established for studying certain aspects of nation states or political systems' deliberativeness. And on the other hand, democracy, the research tradition of democracy measurements that is by now also implemented in all established democracy indices that are cited before. And what I'm proposing basically is to take the conceptualization of deliberative theorists as a point of departure, and then to transform these concepts into a measurement approach by applying the procedural guidelines and methodological standards proposed, for example, by Munk and Vercoy, or Moller and Scanning, that concern the conceptualization, operationalization, and measurement process, and the aggregation procedures in the end, and to apply these systematic standards from comparative political science, from the comparative study of democracy, but to take a reflected account of the conceptualization of deliberative theorists as a point of departure. So from that perspective, I'm proposing to restart and to try at least to measure macro deliberativeness, and the results from our explorative studies so far have shown that it's actually possible to analyze political systems macro deliberativeness when we join these two traditions. So the crucial question here in the beginning for all people who are not deliberative theorists in the room, and particularly for all of those who may not even be political scientists, and I'm very excited to also get your input afterwards and to discuss with you. So what is deliberativeness after all, or what's the understanding of democracy and of good democracy that deliberative theorists presuppose? Here, our main summary of deliberative theorists' accounts of what characterizes good political systems, good democracies, is the following. Democratic self-legislation is first and foremost in society, is realized first and foremost in society-wide, free and unrestrained taking and giving reasons about politically relevant issues. And from this perspective, the crucial thing is that civil society communications and the corresponding bottom-up input that is fed into empowered and decision-making institutions is actually realized. So the crucial understanding of democratic legitimacy and of the democratic process, of democratic quality here is that democratic politics works well and has high quality, that democratic systems have high quality when two things happen. On the one hand, people have to exchange, to take and give reasons about contentious issues, about issues where they may not agree on from the very beginning. And on the other hand, what needs to happen apart from this very fact that we may exchange in a sort of civil manner with each other about politics and diverse spaces of political decision-making, is that the decisions that are made, for example, in parliaments or by government representatives, are legitimated by what happens in terms of exchanges amongst the civil society actors, among ordinary citizens, the so-called ordinary citizens. And that at the end of the day, there's something like a bottom-up input. So at the end of the day, the decisions that happen on the top, so in the parliaments, made by government representatives and so on, they're actually legitimated by what happens in the civil society and among ordinary citizens in their exchanges and in the public sphere. So the basic recommendation of democracy measurements when we want to get started and actually want to measure complex concepts and social science or in political science is to build something like a concept tree. Several requirements. I'm not going to go here into the details, but what we can see here when we try to approach this rather complex phenomenon and this complex concepts of deliberativeness and deliberative democratic quality is that there are two necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for a political system to have high deliberativeness. Firstly, a political system must display deliberative quality, or there must be deliberation, there must be deliberative processes in different spaces of a polity. There must be deliberative processes, for example, in the parliament, and there must be deliberative processes, exchanges among the citizens where they take and give reasons in the civil society and in the public sphere. Secondly, there must be something that we may call a flow of communication between different spaces within democratic politics, and particularly from the public to the empowered spaces, particularly from civil society in the public space, mass media, debates, and so on, to empowered spaces. So these things that happen up there must be legitimated by what happens in between citizens and in public spaces. And from this perspective, we can see that we have two basic branches of the concept tree, two main dimensions. We must study deliberation in public and empowered spaces, and we must assess the quality of political communication there. And on the other hand, we must study the flow of communication between these spaces. And I'm going to say a bit more about how precisely we may do that in a minute. So how can we measure macro-deliberativeness. I summarized this here in 4 basic steps. So the first step is to identify the sites where deliberation actually happens in democratic political systems. The second step, when we've done that, is to measure the quality of political communication, of the deliberative quality of political communication in all these different sites. The third step is to measure the flow of communication, so it's frequently called transmissions, and that's my term, between public and empowered spaces in a democratic polity. And the fourth step is to combine these measurements to an aggregate index of macro-deliberativeness. So we have many individual numbers in the end. So we have scores for deliberation in public spaces and scores for deliberation in empowered spaces. And we have a score for transmission, for the frequency and quality of transmissions. But at the end of the day, we must combine all these measurements to an aggregate index. And these are the 4 steps that I'm going to deal with now. So with regards to the first step, map out the system, I also alluded to some parts of this in what I previously said. But the main point here is to identify the spaces in political systems in democratic nation states where deliberation actually happens. You can see here in the visual this basic model of which are often used to explain Habermas's central periphery model to my students. So we have the live world with all these exchanges and interactions, these informal interactions. We have the public space that is also supposed to filter what happens in the civil society a bit. And then we have empowered spaces. And all of them are crucial to the democratic process and to democratic quality at the end of the day. And what's also crucial is that there's this flow of communication that starts out with what people think, what ordinary people think about politics and about contentious issues, and then ends, not ends, but at least, gives input into what happens in the public space and in the empowered space. So in a more systematic manner, you can see this here on the table. So what we did in small scale studies so far is to identify, based on the conceptual works of democratic theorists, 3 crucial spaces in all democratic nation states: the empowered space, the public space, and the life world, or the informal public space. So the empowered space, this is the space where decision making, collectively binding decision-making happens. Sample sites here can be national courts, parliaments, or also online consultations if they have this decision-making capacity. At the end of the day, that's the crucial criterion. The public space is responsible for processes of opinion and will formation and the aggregation of political interests. Sample sites here are deliberations and debates in political parties, interest groups, but particularly mass media debates. And the live world is supposed to be something like the resource for opinion and will formation, something that we're confronted with every day, but that rarely comes into, at least that's rarely considered by researchers of democratic quality so far. So here, sample sites are civil society organizations, pub conversations, kitchen table conversations is another term to refer to these informal exchanges among citizens, but also social media and discussions among political activists. And what you can see on the right side are the potential data sources for political communication that we can take into account in order to study the quality of political communication in these sites. So with regards to empowered spaces, we have minutes, reports, and protocols from parliamentary debates, for example, or also from federal courts. With regards to the public space, newspaper articles, and they can be online or offline nowadays, but also statements and policy proposals from parties and interest groups can be crucial. And the live world, or the informal public space, often confronts us with the biggest challenges in studying deliberative quality, when we want to include that for obvious reasons, I suppose, because this is something where there's usually no minute or protocol. Many democratic theorists and democracy scholars are complaining, not complaining, but it's often something that's critically considered, the digital space and what goes on in online fora and on social media. But from this perspective, digital media are a really great thing, because finally there's something like a minute or recording of pub and kitchen table conversations. So I'm very happy about that, although it's not easy to analyze at the end of the day. So let's get to task 2. How are we supposed to measure deliberation on all these sites? What I'm proposing here, and what we've been doing so far, essentially draws from established quantitative content analyses. So the discourse quality index, which has been developed by Steenbergen and et al. And first proposed in 2003, or first published, the results have been first published, I think, in 2003, basically draws from manual, or could also be computerized, coding of political communication. There are approaches for both of these tasks, and then applies, can be different aggregation procedures, but in the simplest version, an additive aggregation procedure that calculates DQI, discourse quality index scores, that represent the deliberative quality in different debates in a specific time frame. So what is actually coded when the discourse quality index is applied? What we basically ask is, does political communication conform with the procedural standards of deliberative theory? And this means, do political agents communicate rationally by giving reasons for their demands? Do they communicate respectfully and behave respectfully also vis-a-vis counter arguments? Do they act respectfully towards other interest groups or opposing demands? And do they bring forward constructive proposals, constructive policy proposals that not only take into account, for example, their side, but may also reflect the other side, and so on, so to actually bridge divides and bring in a constructive solution towards the political issue that may be at stake in this situation. There are certainly more detailed coding instructions for all of these dimensions, but for the sake of clarity, I summarized them here. And then we have these, so when we count these dimensions here, we have 4 main dimensions. And the basic proposal here is to use this coding scheme and also the different procedures used for aggregating DQI scores in individual political communications, in studying sample sites of deliberation in democratic nation states. So the third task that I alluded to is to measure transmission. And here the basic, or the main reason why this is so important from my perspective is that so far, what has been done actually is to study deliberative processes and their procedural characteristics, to study political communication, to evaluate this in multiple sites. So maybe not systematically throughout all sites of democratic nation states in a specific time frame, but my main argument in this research project is that this is not enough, because the basic concept of deliberative democracy and the basic understanding of democratic quality here presupposes that, well, deliberation is necessary but not sufficient. And what we actually need is a bottom-up input from civil society and live world actors into empowered spaces. We need to give actors the opportunity to influence what happens in empowered spaces and what collectively binding decisions are made. So this flow of communication must be measured when we want to measure democratic nation states' deliberativeness, for sure. So the basic concept of transmissions of this communicative flow, and this is a highly metaphorical expression, I'm aware of that. The basic concept of transmission here presupposes that we study the exchanges of that we study the exchanges, the communicative exchanges between different sides of the deliberative or political systems as well. And what we mean when we speak about transmissions here is basically, or we conceptualize it basically as a triple relationship. So we say what is crucial is that arguments, topics, or discourses, transmission objects of different kinds, are transmitted from a side A to a side B of a political system. And what we want to study at the end of the day is the uptake of the transmission objects that occur in public spaces, of the arguments, topics, and discourses that are put forward by agents communicating and exchanging in public spaces. We want to study this uptake of transmission object in empowered institutions. And to this, we also need to study the direction of transmissions. So we cannot just study, okay, and how far are the transmission the transmission objects in public spaces, so arguments, topics, and discourses, overlap with those in empowered spaces. We also need to study, okay, what's actually, what we also need to track the exchanges. We also need to assess what's actually the direction of the exchanges that happen there between public and empowered spaces. So it's crucial that these transmission objects, it's a bit of a technical term, but arguments, topics, and discourses put forward by different kinds of actors actually originate in public spaces and then travel to empowered spaces. So, very briefly put, and this is a long and ongoing toddler project by now, so where we've been studying and where we've been analyzing data from a Hamburg case study and now from a German case study as well. I'm gonna give some examples in the end, but the very basic approach in a nutshell can be summarized in 3 steps. So what we want to do in the first step is to explore the content of political communication in public and empowered spaces. So what we did when we studied political communication with the discourse quality index was basically to study the procedural aspects of these communications. So in how far do they conform with the standards of deliberative theory, in how far are the exchanges civil, in how far are the exchanges respectful and rational and argumentative, and so on. What we now need to do is to study in how far the contents, the arguments and topics and discourses put forward by agents in public spaces are actually also represented in empowered spaces. And to this aim, we need to know what these contents are in the first place. This can be quite tricky when we have to deal with large amounts of textual data, and however we may choose sample sites in the end, and however we may find rationales to restrict the number of sample sites, when we actually want to study democratic quality based on this approach, there will be a lot of textual data. So what we did now is to use unsupervised automated content analysis tools to explore the contents of these communications first. So what we're doing right now is to apply a structural topic model to identify hidden semantic structures and patterns of co-occurring words in larger corpora of textual data, for example, in parliamentary recordings and in public space communications. When we did that, well, we have everybody who did topic modeling before here, and there may be some people in the room, they will know that, but when you did that, you have patterns of co-occurring words, but you still have to select and cluster these topics where you actually think that they represent relevant political discourses in the end. So to this aim, we use blended reading procedures. Some scholars also propose to use complementary qualitative research. So far, we're just applying blended reading procedures. And when we did that, we arrived at a selection of the contents of political communications that were relevant in this particular time period. That's a good start, but it still doesn't give us any measurement of transmissions between public and empowered spaces for sure. So the next step here is to determine the share of communicative patterns of discourses, arguments, topics that occur in both public and empowered space deliberations. So that occur on both sides. With this, we can assess the overlaps with regards to the contents of political communications, for example, in parliamentary debates and public space debates. This gives us an approximation of what may happen in terms of exchanges between these sides, but what we're particularly interested in is to approximate the number or the share of topics that originate in public space debates and are then taken up by empowered space deliberations. And to this aim, we determine the share of topics of communicative patterns that originate in public space debates. And well, with originate, we can only approximate this at this step. What we actually mean is we determine the share of communicative patterns that occur in both sides and that first occurred in public space deliberations. And the nice thing about structural topic modeling is that it allows us for including document level metadata such as the time and such as the time and so basically the space where the communicative exchange happens, and we can include them comparatively easily in the analysis. And with this, Roberts et al. Have published a lot on that. And with this, we can actually include this in the analysis and don't have to select this all on a manual basis. So 3 basic steps to at least approximate the exchange of communication. First, explore the content, then select a cluster them to the relevant topics of communication. Third step, track these discourses and track in how far they have been originating in public space debates and then have been picked up on by empowered space deliberations. So the 4th task, and now we're almost at the end of the presentation of the measurement approach. The 4th task then is to do something with all these individual scores. Because what we did now is to measure the deliberative quality of political communication in a lot of individual sites, in different mass media, in parliamentary debates, in court deliberations, and so on and so on. What we also did is to approximate or measure the exchanges that happen between these sites. But at the end of the day, we want to arrive, and I cannot use my hand, so I'm used to. At the end of the day, what we actually want to do is to have an overarching score that represents a nation state's macro deliberativeness, and that's what we need to do now, and why we need an aggregation rule to combine all these individual values. So when we have a look at the conceptualization that I presented in the beginning, and keep in mind that the core thing that needs to be represented by the aggregation rule is actually the conceptual logic, then we get at least hints for how to design this aggregation rule. So with regards to the two attributes below macro deliberativeness, my main claim was that transmissions and deliberative quality in public and empowered spaces are both necessary, but only jointly sufficient. So neither of them is sufficient taken on its own. So this means that our aggregation rule must represent precisely this. So it could be either a minimum rule or a multiplicative rule, but at the end of the day, it must represent the fact that both of them are necessary for nation states' macro deliberativeness. With regards to how to basically combine the DQI scores, the deliberative quality in individual deliberative sites that you can see here on the bottom of the concept tree. The basic thing here is that we think that they can compensate for each other. So the fact that, for example, one mass media space does not display any deliberative quality at all can be compensated by high deliberative quality or deliberative quality in another space. So from this perspective, we here choose an additive aggregation rule and basically accumulate the individual scores for deliberative quality in these spaces. So this is a representation of precisely this. So departing from the concept tree and the conceptual logic that we assume with regards to macro deliberativeness, to nation states or political systems deliberativeness, we think that the main rationale here is that macro deliberativeness is a combination of the transmission score that we calculated and the quality of deliberation in individual sites. The quality of deliberation in individual sites can be accumulated, and the transmission score and the sum of the deliberative qualities in individual sites, so to speak, will be combined by a multiplicative rule. So, to recapitulate, the main goal here is to study democratic nation states' quality and to study this quality from the perspective of deliberative democratic theory. We want to do this, or we're doing this currently because we think that deliberative theorists really have a point when they highlight the merits of studying democracies also from this normative perspective, and I'm going to say a bit more about why we consider this also to be valuable in studying political crisis phenomena. To do this, however, we need to first identify the sites of deliberation in political systems in public and empowered spaces. We then must measure the quality of deliberation in individual sites, measure the flow of communication or transmissions between public and empowered spaces, and then combine these measurements to an aggregate index. So, to what purpose should we do this after all? So this is a highly complex thing to do. It takes a lot of resources, and there are, after all, other measurements of democratic quality. So it's not just something I think that can be interesting to people who are in the academic ivory tower, but studying democratic quality from this perspective and studying it systematically in comparative studies can be crucial to because nation states or democracies deliberativeness is usually considered to impact, on the one hand, citizens' support and political stability for democratic institutions. When a political system is taken to have high deliberative quality, we also are expecting, or scholars of democracy are also expecting, that citizens overall display higher levels of competence and political knowledge, or also understanding with regards to complex political issues, and that they, over time at least, become socialized also to be more empathetic and to display this civility also in political debates. So let's assume that deliberative quality of nation states, of democracies, actually has these positive effects. From this perspective, on the one hand, it would be crucial to identify measures for institutional reform and to systematically study what kind of institutional settings and makeup, for example, of democratic nation states, particularly facilitates the deliberative quality of democratic nation states. So far, we have some assumptions about what may or may not work, but actually, so far, there's no systematic comparative assessment because there's no such thing as a measurement approach that allows us to systematically study and compare what happens in terms of deliberative quality, deliberative democratic quality in different nation states. And well, the other thing is, if the deliberative nation states deliberativeness is or actually has all these positive impacts on citizen support, on political stability, and so on, then it's also a quite useful thing to counteract contemporary democratic crisis phenomena. And this particularly holds if democratic crisis phenomena can be conceptualized as a crisis of political communication. And Dreisig et al. Have done that in political science in the Science magazine last year, so 2020, I think. So where they actually provided an assessment of contemporary democratic crisis phenomena, such as, well, populism, but also declining levels of citizen support and so on, and argued that this is actually a crisis of political communication. So to counteract such crisis phenomena, we would have to know how and under what conditions we can improve the deliberativeness of democratic nation states, and to that aim, we need a systematic comparison in the first place. I'm very curious to hear afterwards from your side as well, in how far you think that the COVID crisis is the current crisis, if there's such a thing as a crisis, but let's say contemporary crisis phenomena are actually a crisis of political communication, if you would conceptualize things that are going on in the public sphere right now as a crisis of political communication. I don't want to presuppose that at this step. And in how far you think that this can be, the basic approach you presented here can be helpful for you to study or compare such phenomena. But thank you very much for your attention, and all questions and comments, not only those mentioned by me now, are certainly very welcome now.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very nice talk, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I think we have a lengthy discussion on that. So if you want to contribute to the discussion, you can, as always, use the hand tool in Zoom, or you can just also switch on your microphone. I think it always worked very well. Okay, so let me see. Is there a first question for Dannica?
May I?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for this talk. It's very, very inspiring. To answer your question to our side, I think your approach can be very, very helpful. If you are going to try to translate your approach from questions concerning polities, political systems, to a smaller scale policy processes or policy sectors within a polity, then I'm sure we can do the same steps you are proposing for your question and approach, to identify the sites of deliberation and to measure the quality within these sites, and then also to look at the transformation from one side to the other. For example, one of these public spaces, not located and maybe in life world, but in something like Habermas would have called the inner periphery. For example, university or research sites, the Robert Koch Institute could work as such an public space, and an empowered space would then be maybe the cabinet, which is informed by the Koch Institute. That's way. Then if you would use your tools this way, we could do a lot of things. Maybe we can also look at some other flows of communication. When it starts last spring, one important flow of communication was top-down, to the people trying to inform their behavior, so that the spread of the pandemic could be contained. And the interesting thing, that since the autumn, we have also bottom-up processes now, but it starts in the first way with interfering between periphery and the institutes and the cabinet, and then the administration and top down. Now when it becomes vice versa, the processes are reversing and becoming more complex. But in the end, we can use a lot of your tools, maybe insert some new one. That's my impression, yeah.
Yeah, I actually think, as you just said, when we apply in the beginning, when we apply what you're saying here about democratic nation states to smaller units or policy processes, then we can apply this as well to the COVID situation and so on. And I actually think it's way easier to apply it at smaller scale. So my main point of departure was to find something that you can at the end of the day apply to big units, so to democratic nation states, to political systems in these terms. But political systems for sure can also be smaller units. So we've been studying policy processes in Hamburg, so which is a quite small unit, comparatively speaking. But we're currently also, I wanted to bring data, and then I calculated this all night, and then something went wrong. So I didn't bring them at the end of the day. Sometimes life is like that. But what we've been doing over the past weeks is to analyze abortion debates from the 90s. Retrospectively, so parliamentary debates and public space debates, and to analyze the quality of deliberation as well as the flow of communication there. And this was quite issue specific. So both things work. To have like a unit, a smaller unit is sometimes more feasible than having this large unit, although we want to end up there at the end of the day. And you can focus on one particular issue of debate and then study the exchanges that happened there with regards to this issue or a couple of issues and discourses.
I have maybe first a fundamental question. Somehow I had the feeling that, well, I mean, yes, of course, the feeling is deliberative democracy is something that is, well, let's put it that way, is good, you know, so there is a lot of communication, people discuss rationally and want to try to find a solution. But unfortunately, I think what we have seen also, you know, in political populism, but also with respect to the COVID-19 debate, is that there are sub-camps in the political discussion which have their own rationality and which have different criteria. They cannot really well, all say this is the correct kind of debate. So my question would be, you know, how can you compensate for that? So do you not put into your political theory to analyze the political situation already something that, well, might be good, but which doesn't exist in a sense?
Okay, so maybe we would have to see if it really doesn't exist after analyzing it from my perspective. But I guess I know what you're referring to. So so what we can certainly observe. Maybe in the COVID crisis, also another political crisis is. Well, it may be a crisis of communication, but maybe it cannot be solved by more deliberative democracy and more deliberation. This may be a suspicion, because there are people. Well, we need to get people to talk to each other in these ways, and we would have to make them apply these high standards of rationality and civility and so on, and the respective logics. We would have to enable them to, conform with shared logics of rational argumentation and discourse at the end of the day, and well, to also well, be informed about everything and to not be deceived at the end of the day about politics and so on. So on. You may say, okay, that's all utopian. And I mean, as a democratic theorist, you may want to think that, but as an empirical researcher, this may not be the solution to all of this. Well, I'm not sure if, no, I'm just, it's not, I get the point. I think that this may be an issue. So I think one crucial thing for me is we cannot assume that all individuals actually conform with the high standards of deliberative theory. They won't.
Yeah, that's exactly.
What we can, however, see, and one interesting expectation often is that ordinary citizens are not really able to conform with these standards. And then the crucial question from my perspective is usually, okay, I don't think that there are people who are by nature unable to conform with these standards. I believe that these standards, or well, the ways people communicate, the ways they interact and behave actually in politics, crucially depend upon the ways they've been socialized and upon the, well, boundary conditions in which they have been raised. So for me, the longer term perspective would also be to have a look at, okay, under what institutional conditions, economic and, well, social boundary conditions do political systems of whatever unit actually arrive at a higher level of overall deliberativeness, of macro deliberativeness, and what can we well, deduce from this about how we can promote this at the end of the day. Maybe parliamentary systems are better equipped than presidential systems or something like that. So I think that won't be the main finding. But at the end of the day, such questions also about the institutional boundary mechanisms and the broader structural environment can be answered based on this. That's the first part of the answer. I think another interesting part of considering these phenomena is maybe that's a more short-term perspective before we revolutionize politics after all. But another aspect is how can we facilitate exchanges between different echo chambers, communicative bubbles, where different logics are applied and so on. And I think that may be something where it's actually easier to establish at least a bit of a more solid communicative flow and uptake to initiate an uptake of what happens in political communications, to incentivize political actors to address.
Be a bit more precise. You know, what I had in mind was also the following. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, you have, of course, a very obvious, also scientifically, let's say, secure basis, because, you know, when there are no infections anymore, then everything is okay. And everybody would agree on that. You know, even somebody who doesn't know much about this, but if he doesn't see his neighbors dying anymore, then he's also more happy than before. So there is a scientific basis, and that is relatively objective. I mean, of course, we can discuss objectivity in science, but it is relatively objective. Whereas in other political questions, it's not true that you usually have such a scientific basis, but you have different values, you know, and that might separate communities. And there is no way, no scientific way, but also no political way that you can call one better than the other. You know, there might be two possible lifestyles or whatever it is. So I think these two things need to be differentiated. So,
so I mean, well, with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, you may say, okay, on the one hand, we have like a secure, sort of objective basis for certain policy proposals, at least, or for certain contentious issues. People are either dying from COVID or not. That's certainly true. But at the same time, I believe that all, well, political issues that deal with how resources should be distributed, or on what basis, for example, certain groups of people may go to work and others may not, and so on. These are also questions where issues of values and interests come into play. So it's not only about facts at the end of the day. And from my perspective, that's not something bad. That's something unavoidable as soon as we're dealing with politics. But at this step, well, deliberation becomes even more crucial from my perspective, because then people have to connect to each other and others' values and others' rationals and so on. And they have to develop at least an understanding for why other people think in other ways in order, to increase long-term support for what happens in politics. And this flow of communication, I think, would be crucial with regards to also securing the support for contentious measures and so on.
Yeah, that's a good answer. There is one hand. Luca, please. Luca, your microphone is switched off.
Okay, thank you. It was very interesting. Yeah, my question is related to the fact that, in a sense, okay, comes very close to what Marcus was somehow saying, I guess. Namely, the fact that in the description, if you want, in the model that you are somehow presenting, all the agents, let me call it this way, namely all the people, if you want, are somehow considered the same footing. But unfortunately, it's not like that. Namely, let me get to one issue that is coming up at the moment, I think, and it is related to the fact that in the pandemic now, the big problem, the big issue is related to the production and distribution of vaccines. Now, I am very happy that eventually in the public discourse is coming up the fact that pharmaceutical companies should be obliged to give up the not royalties, but the right to have the royalties in this period. They just have to release the fact that they have to release the productions and the production techniques in such a way that every country should be allowed to produce the vaccine. Okay, but this is of course something that is a matter. I mean, it's in the public discourse. People are discussing about it, but there is a clear. It's not a matter of deliberating anything. I mean, there is what I see is a possible fight between two powers, if you want, namely the power of the people that are, basically all the nation need that. And of course, there are the rights, or if you want, the rights of the pharmaceutical company that for sure they want to keep their royalties. It's clear, it's we can stay very long discussing this point, but in the end, what will decide? I'm sorry to say that, but it will be the force. I mean, if overall in the world there will be some sort of general agreement on this point, nation states will force I hope, to release this data from the pharmaceutical companies to allow people to get their vaccine. So I fear that in some cases, it's really a matter of, unfortunately, to impose certain decisions because the stakeholders are so different that hardly they will end up in obtaining, a common decision. Or so my feeling is that, in a sense, that in the model you are describing, it's extremely interesting, but somehow I would include also the weight of different powers, if you want. namely the empowered place is the empowerment, the place where empowerment, comes in, come into play is are different in many situations, and sometimes they are colliding. So that's the point.
Yeah, yeah. So I think. Well, one thing is the normative stance of deliberative theory at this point. Well, deliberative Democrats are all in when it comes to equal distribution of power and using communicative power to well, create, not design, but maybe well, co-design politics with communicative power. So this would be a very egalitarian approach. And I think from this perspective, or this normative stance and the recommendations that follow up have often been accused, sometimes for good reasons, for forgetting power and the power structures in the so-called real world. And that's also like a valid objection and a good thing we need to think about. I think the point here is not so much to say, okay, and this flow of communication bottom up is how politics works, and that's a like perfect description of what happens in the real world. The point here would be to say, the better this well, this model works, or the better this ideal is fulfilled, the more this ideal is fulfilled, the better certain other things will work. Yeah, so, well, and in the real world, we have to deal with power imbalances. We have to deal also with unequal distributions of resources, and both are unsurprisingly connected. Yes, all that is true. Then there are two things we can take into account. First of all, I think we can still see in a lot of political processes that communicative power is not solely soft power that doesn't do anything to politics, but in some cases, people acting together based on exchanging about their like shared goals and so on actually had some power on state actors and corporate agencies and so on. So when this happens on a collective basis, this can have an impact. Must not, but can have a big impact. So, well, that may not be what happens with regards to the specific thing you just mentioned, and that may not be the only thing we need to take into account. But I think my point here would just be, yeah, such power imbalances and resource distributions are crucial. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider them. I'm far from that. The only thing I'm saying is, well, probably when there are huge power imbalances, and this would be what I would expect from a theoretical as well as from an empirical perspective, political systems' macro-deliberativeness will be lower. So from that perspective, we should also think about how to counteract such structural inequalities in order to facilitate this understanding. So I'm not like offering a complete description of political reality. I'm aware that this is something crucial, but it's not part of the concept of deliberativeness, and for that reason, I'm not measuring it.
Thank you.
So I think this comment can be combined with other considerations. So it's not like I don't consider them, but it would be more like would be more like an intervening variable or one of the independent variables in the study on what promotes or facilitates or obstacles political systems macro-deliberativeness.
Perhaps a follow-up in that direction. So, so that's again, I can only agree that's an intriguing theory and a nice idea to get some quantitative measure into the game. But so how far is that rooted in our culture, in our understanding of politics? So you have here large debate in the moment about colonialism, etc., and then something like in that direction. So do we superimpose some concepts to other states? We want to be all universal. That's what I understand. Or is it really something where you can say no? There's only a minimum of my culture involved in these ideas.
Well, so that's more a question to me to my theoretical, to my theorist part, or the theorist
I
part of myself, or something like that, probably than to the empirical scholar, because I have to talk about like the concept and the theoretical understanding of the background here. So, well, I would be very careful about saying, well, the understanding of deliberative democracy that Habermas or Dreisig, whoever is promoting, or that I'm also promoting in my forthcoming book, that's something universal that can be applied to all contexts. And well, I have this universalistic understanding of what actually good politics is, and this has to be realized in all contexts and so on. I would be very careful for obvious reasons to do that. So that's not my point. So the main point of departure here is, in terms of measuring democracy, all models or understandings of democracy sort of have a theoretical background, and all theoretical understandings of democracy are necessarily also rooted in a cultural background. Let's bring another understanding, or let's pluralize researching democracy from this perspective, and not only impose like a liberal representative understanding of democracy or democratic quality on all states when we're measuring democratic quality in the first place. Yeah, so plurality from this perspective is good in terms of having plural assessments of nation states' quality in the first place. That's not solving the post-colonial thought and question and the concerns in the background, but at least plurality here is something good from my perspective, to not impose just one model. So not just apply one model when we're studying and comparing democratic nation states. Second thing would be, well, I'm not sure if deliberative democracy, or in how far, maybe it's more like in how far question, in how far deliberative democracy is an understanding that could be accepted by different cultures, and yeah, to what extent it could be accepted. And maybe there's a different interpretation of this. I'm currently talking to a lot of East African scholars about their understandings of democracy and what democracy actually is about, and what good democracy is about. And the impression that I got so far, but maybe I'm speaking to, well, for me, the right people, the wrong people to get the opposite point of view. But my impression so far is that they are quite interested in deliberative democracy as a basic model for two main reasons, maybe. So one core reason would be that the liberal representative party democracy model is something that has really been implemented by the West. So the institutional structures that are fairly firmly aligned with this model really has been implemented literally in East Africa, and may not fit their context. That's what some people say. The second reason is, that's again quite context specific here, but the second reason is that Habermas, from my perspective, Habermas's understanding, also John Dreisig's understanding of deliberative democracy, is less about rational reason giving and all this. It's more about communicative action, about acting together based on creating a cooperative understanding and a collective mode of action, and yeah, creating a shared understanding, acting collectively, not based on strategic interests. So theory of communicative action starts out there. And I got the impression that this sort of, sense for collective interest and for creating a shared understanding is something that some scholars, at least here, can sympathize with, and that is way more, at least that they can sympathize with way more than with a very liberal individualistic understanding of what democracy is about. So from that perspective may fit, for example, here, well, from my experience and my exchanges so far, but that's something I think we have to cross-check again and again with other scholars, certainly, and then we have to think about these applications in a very sensitive, context-sensitive way. But at the end of the day, well, when it comes to measuring and assessing democracy's quality, I think actually bringing another model and another understanding than a liberal representative understanding into the game can be something good. Imposing, from what I want to do with this, imposing seems a bit harsh, because I don't want to impose anything on anybody. I'm just interested in how far, well, certain institutional, social, economic, whatever structures may facilitate this understanding of democracy or this understanding of democratic quality, and then study these phenomena. So I'm not saying that it needs to be realized. And well, my approach also is not proposing any specific democratic institutions or something like that. It's actually not a de jure measurement, it's a de facto measurement, what happens de facto in terms of exchanges and political communications, and it's not tied to a specific institutional setting. And from that perspective, I actually consider it quite flexible with regards to these concrete political questions about how to implement it at the end of the day.
So we of course like to go back to most simple systems and very, very simple structures and to mechanisms. And so just an association, one perhaps could think about these things. I think that the name is Tomasello, right? This guy in Leipzig, in this anthropological Max Planck, who claims that the human society would form in small groups, and the norms in these groups have been quite different, but it was important for the group to align, so there was something like an competition, and only those who could really align and work together would win. And so that could be perhaps a setting where one could think about. Well, it's hard to say, but it's universal. But to place that in very, very simple context, where you have a very simple structure, and where you could see whether that could really explain if something like an alignment and building up of some norms would happen. I don't know. So that's just an association.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I think that is a very good observation to put that into a kind of evolutionary context of how it evolves with communication.
Yeah. I fully agree with that, what Johannes said, and also the pointing to Michael Tomasello and his research. And so, but the interesting finding is also what he's postulating, that actually in these smaller groups, that there is something objective that it's arising, objective norms and so, and in a way, and that can be detected. It's also an issue in the discussion of the last minutes in several cultures. This, if we understand deliberation just in this way as giving and taking reasons for another arguments or for actions, then we find this in several cultures. In Africa, it's the Ubuntu, and in India, I experienced this very much. It's the idea of the argumentative Indian, as Amartya Sen would have taken it.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Yeah, no.
One critical thing about this, and this has been pointed out by a number of theorists and empirical researchers by now. So one critical thing is, or actually starts out with how you define deliberation, or well, good deliberative political communication in the first place. So this was one branch of my concept tree, and what I presented here was actually like a fairly narrow or conservative model of what deliberation is all about. So it's about rational exchange of arguments conducted in a civil manner, respectful, and so on. And Iris Marion Young, for example, argued from a feminist perspective that this is actually a quite masculine ideal, or an ideal that is frequently or mostly fulfilled by masculine communication. Well, a number of people also say, okay, this is not only something that is like a male idea of communication, it's also quite a white and male ideal of how communication proceeds. So women may communicate more emotionally. There are some empirical studies on that, just using other not using arguments, but using other kinds of arguments.
Excuse me. This is really funny. This reminds me, I don't know, I guess you have read this, Intellectual Impostures, written by Alain Sokal and Jean-Bric Mon, right? So this is funny because this somehow turns out to be the same. They made this observation, looking at this kind of comment looks like what in Victorian age a man would say about a woman wanted to, say, study science. Say, oh, well, no, she can't you know, because she's different, she thinks differently, so she can't study science.
No, nobody's
this
saying.
Really, I mean, I mean, I don't know why certain feminism point of view turns out to be somehow supporting right the opposite. This is really funny.
No, I mean, the thing here actually is, and I think there's 2 points. I get what you're referring to, I think, but the thing here is to claim, okay, on the one hand, having a specific type of communication, argumentative exchange as the sole ideal that needs to be fulfilled by all human beings to count as good political communicators or deliberators may not be the right thing to do, particularly when we define this from a specific normative vantage point and from a specific perspective that is actually not a neutral perspective, but the perspective of, well, let's say old white males. That's Iris Marion Young points of departure. And then when we have a look from this normative vantage point at what happens in political communication or in communication generally, we may see that, well, surprise, surprise, women may not conform on average to the same degree with these standards as, well, males do. But we can also see that people of higher social status are more likely to conform with these ideals, that people who have been raised in Western cultures will be more likely to conform with these ideals. So the thing here is not to say, okay, well, women can't communicate that well, need to learn how to do that better, or, well, non-Western people need to learn how to argue rationally, but more to adapt our standards when we actually want to speak for all people or to compare communication and democracy and whatever, in different contexts, and to adapt our standards, because who's telling us that a specific way to argue and exchange arguments and so on is the only way to go? It's not obvious, and I think, well, yeah, it's neither obvious nor self-evident. There's a claim for neither of these things so far that I
rationality and emotions are universal among women, men, and so, I mean, it's just
yeah, maybe specific kinds of formal rationality and so on, but I think what comes into play in communication is quite actually has a lot of dimensions, and there are a lot of ways to give reasons, to be brief, and depending on how we've been raised and in what context and so on, it's not just universal emotional or rationality. There are many things that come into play that are crucial when it comes to how we exchange about something with people with whom we may not disagree to start with.
Could I come back maybe at the end of the discussion to let's say the mathematical structure of your theory? And I would like to give you a concrete example. So we were discussing behavioral input into our epidemiological models. So the data somehow suggests that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of solidarity in the population. Everybody was shocked about, we always cite these films from Bergamo, so from northern Italy, where it started in Europe, and very bad scenes. And so the solidarity was quite high. Whereas one has the impression that now, in the third lockdown or so, this cooperativity has really dramatically decreased. So what I wanted to do with that example is to bring in, the temporal aspect of all of that, of deliberation. So I was, when I listen to a talk like yours, I'm having these mathematical modeling concepts always in the background. And one of the big distinctions is that between dynamical models and static models. And that was, in my opinion, not so quite clear in your aspects. So, for example, what I would think is very important are such feedback loops. That's how I call them. So to understand how the state of deliberation in the society is actually changing. And that, I think, mostly is connected to what you called transmission. But, for us, that is a kind of rate of information exchange. But you haven't really defined it like that. And also and the problem would be then if I look at your index formula, so you had multiplied transmission with the state of the system. And then the temporal aspect of your index is, I think, relatively misleading, let's say. It could be misleading, potentially at least, if you introduce it like that. So maybe my question is a conceptual question. So is it true that your objects of deliberation, so the different communities, I completely agree with you that you have a multi-scale structure. You know, it should go from individuals to larger institutions, maybe families where you discuss these things, and then, you know, to more formal things like parliaments and etc. So that is one thing. But you know, how do you bring in this temporal aspect? So how do you measure actually how, for example, communication changes, how one influences the others? Because for that you would need a kind of time series approach.
Yeah. I didn't include that here, and I also call it feedback loops, yeah, at some point. So the feedback loop I'm referring to in political communication are, well, so we're currently analyzing these abortion discourses, to give a concrete example. And we're starting out with some public space debate that actually occurred before the, let's say, call it big parliamentary deliberations, was to Lesung in the German Bundestag in 1991 and 2. So it was before that. Then we have a look at, okay, how did these deliberations proceed? What contents are included in these deliberations? Then we have a look at the next public space debates occurring after these parliamentary deliberations, and then at the court decision and how the court argues for that. That's the basic thing. We're applying these measurements to all of these phases. So now one crucial, like my point of departure first is, okay, I want to know what share of transmission objects actually arrives in empowered institutions. But so when we have a look at political processes, certainly it does not go only one way, but the communicative flow could be transmissions, or like, let's say the communicative flow, I'm calling it transmissions also in the articles. The transmissions also go in the other direction, certainly, and that can be quite crucial for political communication. We can actually see that in these abortion debates, because one crucial finding here is there's a big overlap in terms of the contents of political communication, for example, in mass media debates and in parliamentary debates, and also in the court deliberations at the end of the day. So this looks quite good. Well, we now could assess where did it all start, but that's quite hard to determine at the end of the day. And what we always, or what the interesting thing here is actually that the public sphere debates after the parliamentary deliberations and over time actually take up topics from parliamentary deliberations and become, they approximate the patterns of the parliamentary deliberations over time more and more. So that's a preliminary finding right now, which is also congruent with the findings of other communication scholars from that time period. So it's, and the thing here is, how can we analyze these flows in both directions? And what we're basically doing here is, well, we can actually calculate a share of what occurs where first for both directions. So we can understand, okay, and how big is the share of topics that originate in public spaces, and what share of topics originated in empowered spaces when we have this assessment. What we're interested in for the measurement of macro deliberativeness is the question: is this the share of topics that actually originated or occurred first in public space deliberations? But this doesn't mean that what happens in the other direction is not interesting or important for political systems or political processes. it's a fairly complex analysis anyway. So from that perspective, for this measurement, we just needed to keep it simple. And if it's of any interest, or if it's of a particular interest, what happens in terms of exchanges between spaces back and forth, you can adapt the time frame basically that you're analyzing, and then have a look at the next measurement or so. Yeah, so just when you're analyzing different time frames that follow up, as we're doing in these abortion debates, you get a grip on that. So the question is always, at what scale and with what purpose are you measuring macro-deliberativeness here? When you're actually assessing multiple debates in one democratic nation state in, let's say, a time range of 4 or 5 years or something like that, you will have to make your job a bit easier when you're only accessing the share of topics that are communicated in this one direction, and are trying to not analyze feedback loops at the same time. Doesn't mean that they're not interesting. I think you can get a grip on that when you adapt the time frame that you're analyzing, and then analyze different time frames consecutively.
Do you mean that there is a sort of iteration of the process, right?
Well, I mean, the problem in all of this is usually, what causes what. So the only thing you get from the data are, of course, correlations. So that is the usual problem.
But so you can, so what many qualitative scholars, a couple of qualitative scholars in the field are doing is really, also quite resource-intensive process tracing for these communicative processes. The problem here is that you won't get a grip on this at large scale with these amounts of data from my perspective. So there's going to be no assessment of cause and effect, strictly speaking. You're analyzing topics of co-occurring words, and then the only grip, I'm not saying that you actually analyze the flow of communication, the only grip that you can get on a potential flow of communication at large scale is to analyze, okay, what follows up, or with temporal sequence, basically. And temporal sequence certainly is not cause and effect. It's a precondition for cause and effect.
Sometimes you can, for example, I mean, I saw such analysis in newspaper articles, for example, where you can see who was writing from whom. So when you track sources, so in this sense, you could do it. But it's very hard. I agree with that.
So my concern here would be there are also some famous analysis, for example, on the abortion discourses that we're just analyzing, shaping abortion discourses, published in the early 20s. And this communication scholars, also political social scientists, and they actually analyzed the standing of civil society actors and state actors in newspaper articles. So how frequently are certain people or groups cited? I think the problem here for me is we will have to we're dealing with very heterogeneous data. So these are recordings, minutes, these are maybe social media. We also analyze social media posts and stuff like that, comments on online platforms, on tabloids and stuff like that. When you have all these heterogeneous textual data on political communication, analyzing something like standing or who is citing whom gets quite hard, because it will look differently in all of these data formats or in all of these textual sources, one thing. The other thing is we're always looking also for things that can computerize and or automated analysis tools, basically. And when you're introducing these complications, it will get far harder. So I think when you're analyzing something at a smaller scale, you can combine this measurement and the approximation of the communicative flow with a qualitative analysis, and you will have, when it's a small scale, you can do that afterwards. And when it's large scale, you have to cross validate afterwards. But my expectation would be that some things would also all balance at large scale. So there may be some communicative flows that you actually at the end of the day consider to originate somewhere else or something like that. But at least you get an approximation that you otherwise wouldn't get.
I would have some hope for larger timescales, because then I think it's easier, for example, how you track whole concepts or something like that. I think that's relatively well established. And for example, historians even would use such methods. But for intermediate timescales, it's exactly what you say. It's very hard to do.
Probably is one case. I mean, you mentioned the abortion issue. I was thinking to the case of Poland at the moment. There is a sort of social turmoil, you know, because the local government passed a very, well, let me call it reactionary law, and according to which basically Polish women cannot, basically they abolished the abortion. In fact, women are obliged to travel, I guess, to come to Germany or to go elsewhere. And there is I mean, on small time scale, it's clear that in this flow of information between, you know, the social environment, the society, and if you want, the power space, it's clear that in this interaction, somehow the society is reorganizing itself, right? So there are structures appearing, and probably small groups, you know, cooperating and realizing lots of you know, activities in order to reestablish, you know, to send a message to the power, if you want, change that law, you know, go back to the previous position, if you want. So it's clear that on small scale, in certain situation, in crisis situation, you have the formation of small groups, and right. I mean, that's and in this case, this type of probably in a crisis, in certain situation, you might have that the information flow on small social scale are even more effective, right?
It's an interesting idea that information flow can also accelerate. So it's
well, it can accelerate when you have small groups, you know, which are very focused, of course, on a certain issue, not on general issue probably, but a small issue.
Yeah. So I mean, this is these discourses when it comes to political protests, and I mean, then you always need agents who actually take the matter in their hands and pursue it with the right sort of engagement and effectively and so on. It's an art in itself, probably. But let's say you have them and such protest movements where communicative power also unfolds from this theoretical stance. Are a good example for how such communicative power can basically counteract institutionalized power as well. Well, we don't know how this particular case will end, but there are other instances where we could observe that this can be one tool to counteract also empowered institutions and so on. What do we actually like to proposing in terms of analyzing political systems, deliberativeness, and comparing it is to study, well, on the one hand, debates on highly contentious issues, such as abortion policies is usually, in most societies, it's a highly contentious issue when a debate is ongoing, or also social justice issues and so on. There are a couple of issues that are, well, there may not be a universal ideal, but some things are universally quite contentious. But to study not only them, but to study also issues with low degrees of polarization in societies, and then basically to sample debates in democratic nation states in accordance with these two criteria, because you won't be able to assess, let's say, in a time frame of 5 years, all debates throughout. Wouldn't even know what that would be. So we're proposing to select highly contentious issues and, well, more consensual issues, and to then on this basis have an estimation of nation states, deliberativeness, or political systems whatever kind of units deliberativeness, because it cannot be, so the features of deliberation, of communicative action, Habermas terms, with regards to highly contentious and less contentious issues differ a bit. And we would expect that, well, this also plays out in terms of what we have as a result when we study macro deliberativeness. So from that perspective, we're trying to find issues that are somehow on different layer, on different levels of being polarized or contentious in societies. And abortion is our case for a highly polarized issue.
Well, I think we should stop here. But it was very interesting. There are many ideas floating in my mind, I hope in everybody's mind. So I hope we stay in contact and discuss further sometime. And I would like to thank you, Dannica, once more. It was really a very nice talk.
Thank you so much for the exchange.
Thank you.
Okay, so,
Bye.
bye.
Everyone.